Hey, welcome. All right, so yeah, today we're going to talk about vibrato. Just explain what it is, how we find it, things to avoid, certain problems that people face with vibrato, even after you've developed it. And so, understanding sort of what it is helps us understand uh, how to find it, and also how to sort of address when it's out of balance. And the key term with vibrato is finding balance. We drop into this sort of state, and so it's really tricky because as we're like trying to find vibrato, sometimes we're overdoing things, and we have to learn how to um, allow our body to sort of drop into this sort of place of balance. And so it's really a sensation that you have to develop by searching around, and ultimately, it is a product of healthy singing. So you don't have to do anything super fancy, and usually through the process of working on your voice, working on your support and your resonance, you'll start to develop vibrato. And you may just not realize that you're doing it a lot of time. That's why it's important to record yourself, have a teacher help you identify when it's happening. And we can talk about sort of like what typically happens when people develop vibrato and where they start to find it. Um, and so it's just like a really important thing to understand, because when we learn how to develop our vibrato, it actually helps us open up our voice more. And so we'll go over sort of what sort of is happening and why that's the case. But vibrato actually helps sort of relax the voice ultimately, and sort of nourishes it and builds up momentum as we're singing really high notes, as we're sustaining notes. But like anything else, if you over sort of rely on that and you don't really work on the other skills that sort of produce and help us maintain our vibrato, it can start to develop bad habits as well. So please ask questions. This one, sometimes just like with like resonance and things like that, pretty much every topic, support, it takes a sec to really start to feel this in your own body. And so I really like to hear sort of the struggles and things that other people do that help them find their vibrato or understand it a little more. And so yeah, make this sort of like a hands-on thing. You can try a lot of these exercises that I'm doing, and you don't have to do them exactly where I'm singing them. Ultimately, you're going to want to find a comfortable place in your range, middle of your voice, to really start working on this. And then it extend to your lower and your higher range as well. So let's go through the concept. So vibrato, like one of the best ways you can explain it, right, is it's a product of healthy singing. When we get the right balance of pressure underneath the vocal folds and resonance above the vocal folds, those two things help our vocal folds start to vibrate. And then the whole mechanism, actually our larynx and even muscles in our breath support, and our diaphragm, they start to oscillate. And so the muscles are contracting and relaxing. And you can think about like when we build momentum with like swinging things, uh, that's sort of this idea. And so our body is actually building momentum and dispersing the pressure. So it's helping our voice actually just regulate itself. So strangely enough, right, as we learn to build up our voice, we're building pressure here. And then we learn to disperse the pressure and properly maintain it, because too much pressure in our vocal folds and this area of our larynx can ultimately lead to vocal health problems. And ultimately, it's like less efficient, right? So we ultimately want a vocal technique that actually uses just the right amount of pressure to get our vocal mechanism oscillating. And then when it's oscillating like that, and this is a good definition of vibrato, is this oscillation, and we'll talk about what that means as well. But once we get it swinging and moving, then it's a lot easier just to add little bits of energy through our resonance, through matching perfect vowels, and through our breath support to just keep it spinning. So it's like you think of like vibrato as that spinning top, and we're just continually kind of pushing that into motion so it keeps spinning. Vibrato is something that helps us with our tone quality. So when people think about adding vibrato, it often will add like a warmth or just a little bit more flexibility into the voice. And so oftentimes people will not quite understand how to explain like what they're hearing. The voice feels like it's maybe falling a little flat or a little dull because there isn't that sort of nice vibration in the sound. And so, yeah, so if you think about the vibrato, what's happening, instead of singing just one perfect pitch, right? Just that perfect frequency. It's actually oscillating around that frequency. So our pitch is changing a little bit higher and a little lower. And we want to think of finding whatever our like sort of pitch that we're actually matching. We want that to be the center point. And then our voice actually oscillates around that pitch. And as we go higher, it'll often get wider. So a vibrato can be characterized by sort of the pitch fluctuation. But the other thing that's really interesting is it actually spikes in volume as well. So there'll be this pulsing of louder to softer and back and forth. So you can think about all of these different sort of variables of oscillation. And so vibrato is a way that we can also increase our volume and overall sound without pushing or forcing. So I kind of think of that as like one of the last steps in terms of how do we expand and open our voice. It makes the pitch range a little bit wider, so that feels louder because it's a sort of this bigger range and the voice is bigger than a straight tone sound. But it also is actually building energetic momentum, and so that helps us increase the resonance. And just make our voice fill up to as big as it can sound. And just know that like over time, your voice will get louder, but you can't really push it. But you can add these elements like vibrato. Again, the difficult concept is feeling like you're dropping into vibrato because it's primarily like an autonomic function. We learn to sort of control it once we get the feeling. But that's what's so weird about it is we're kind of finding these sweet spots where our body starts to drop into that state and we can't consciously force it or manually shake our voice to try and make vibrato happen. So that's good. Those are kind of the main principles. And the really nice sort of consolidated way of thinking about how do I find vibrato? We need space. So we need the right kind of resonant space. And often it's a little further back and a little taller than people would expect. So we think of going a little more towards the classical side, especially if you're having trouble finding vibrato. You're going to want to overdo it that direction. And we'll talk about like imitation as a style to use as well. But we need space and we need spin. Spin being that breath pressure underneath. So the good balance of vocal support and resonance, right? Just a product of healthy singing. And we also need to be able to relax the muscles around our larynx so that they can oscillate without us sort of holding them static. So if you have tongue tension, jaw tension, shoulder tension, any tension around your larynx, that's going to block you from having just a nice smooth vibrato. And it might actually make your vibrato kind of uneven. And so we'll talk about, you can actually hear certain problems or tendencies in a voice based on how the vibrato sounds and its rate as well. So that's the idea. So I'll just demonstrate too, because right, a lot you can explain this, and it's also like a physical thing that you can really start to hear and imitate. Uh, yeah. Okay, we're gonna talk about that because yeah, a lot of the times when anyone's having trouble with vibrato, a particular part's out of balance, and it's not just about having it as open as possible. It's about finding these sweet spots with our vowels so that they get the right kind of resonance bouncing around. So you might actually try more narrow vowels, and so we'll talk about that, and also just working a little more of your vocal support. So the others, yeah. So again, space, spin, and release, and you're going to probably fluctuate between these three concepts until you start to find your vibrato. It's like learning to whistle, these kinds of things where you're just going to have to try some repetition and try not to get too impatient or frustrated with it. Because again, the harder you try, sometimes the more we start to root down and lock our muscles. Um, uh, it's it's not slower, but it tends to get wider actually for people. But that again, it depends on your voice type. But people will find as they go up into higher notes that sometimes the vibrato gets wider, and then that can be ultimately an issue if you're not supporting it with your breath support enough. Um, but you'll start to notice these types of patterns in a voice sometimes. And again, it really depends on the voice type, but pay attention to how your vibrato actually changes throughout your range. And this other element that's really interesting, sort of an intriguing aspect of it, is it's also contingent upon our nervous system. And so when we're like more nervous, we tend to go towards faster, more rapid vibrato as our body is more in this sort of excited, jittery state. And as we relax, it starts to also widen out. So we'll play around with actually, eventually, once you develop your vibrato, you can start to play around with the rate of vibrato. It's funny, right? Because they'll talk about like actual physical classifications here of like 6 to 7 undulations per second is like a normal middle balanced vibrato, which is really funny, right? Because I can't even possibly count that in a second, like how that's happening. But lower than that, and it starts to be a slower vibrato and becomes a wobble. And then faster than that, and it starts to become a tremolo or a flutter. And so we can actually hear a lot about what's happening with the voice and its balance based on that sort of rate of vibrato. So let's talk about it. So straight tone, often is kind of extending the onset of our voice, is like this. So going like and it's really a perception because even there is oscillation in the voice. And so straight tone is kind of a little more of a not a real thing, actually. It's just so subdued that it's not, we can't really notice it audibly and feel it as much. So again, straight tone, just like, what you would imagine with a straight tone. It's just hitting the pitch and like, ma. So we'll talk about how we measure the oscillation. I'll get to that as we go. And then vibrato is going to sound like this, right? So it starts to spin, right? Ma, that straight tone, and then ya, and you'll start to hear this kind of zing, 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 right? Um, that's the sign of vibrato. You might even put your hand here and feel the subtle sort of motion of the larynx. When this gets really pronounced and you see visible shaking of the larynx, that's a sign that it's unstable, actually. So there's different ways that you can start to feel when it's out of balance. And so that's, for example, if it's a wobble, you'll start to actually see more shaking, and sometimes people's heads shake like this, and that's a sign of tension, and it's sort of out of balance. You can think of that pendulum swing where it's a little weighted on one side, so it doesn't quite have that sort of perfect spin to it. So that's sort of the first thing, just so you can hear it, because again, sometimes people aren't quite hearing and perceiving it. But let's talk about some methods to find our vibrato, because that's kind of the most important thing. Again, be patient with this, but the first thing that we want to do is we want to think of a little bit of that release concept right away. So typically when our larynx is a little too tight and it's drawn up into the sort of vocal tract a little bit higher, that's going to block some of that vibrato because we can't get that sort of full cycle of resonance. Yeah, we'll talk about some stylistic things too as well. Like for example, like jazz, the vibrato is often like dovetailed at the end, but it really depends on the style. Sometimes there's full vibrato, sometimes there's more straight tone. Sometimes it has to do with the way that we're trying to get the melody to sound. So yeah. So if you're tending to use too much vibrato, we'll also talk about sort of reverse engineering and how to calm it down. But that we'll get to that a little later on in the process, just to try to keep this a little bit more linear, as linear as possible. So again, the first thing that we want to think about is trying to just get our larynx to drop a little bit. Now we don't want to push this down. Like if I'm like trying to push my throat down, that's going to cause tension on the other side. And that's that concept of too static. So sometimes when people are trying to find this sort of lower larynx concept, they're overdoing it. So a great way of thinking about this is as we breathe, like if you're taking in a little sigh or kind of a feeling of like a backward sort of yawn, and you're breathing in the vowel shape. I like to think of breathing in this nice open ah. The larynx is going to drop a little bit, and then you let it come back up as well. But that's something you can pay attention to as you're taking your breath. You can start to try to find this neutral, relaxed larynx concept. And so when I'm doing this kind of a thing, I might imagine sort of the dopey sound, right? So going like that, and then going like blah blah blah, and I'm trying to get everything to just drop down, right? So that's why I'm using this blah. It's it sounds kind of silly because it's sort of like when we're going blah blah blah, right? We're sort of imitating this concept of relaxing everything, but use that to your advantage and try to see if you can get blah, blah, blah. Just get it to drop. I feel a little hollow, like there's a little bit of backspace. Again, don't overly force the space because sometimes, and this goes to like to Chandler when you're talking about this, sometimes if you're trying to keep your mouth as open as possible, it's actually locking the muscles and that might inhibit the vibrato from happening. That's why this is frustrating. So focus on that floppy feeling, and I would do some exercises like this. Again, focus on the breath first, creating that hollow space, going like blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. And you might do the thing that I do all the time, which is move your head and your neck around. Make sure these muscles aren't locking. You can put your hand gently around here just to feel the activity here. Again, don't try to force it too much. Awareness is kind of key, and it'll start to settle lower as you do this. So, blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. As you do this, think of like a BLAW, blah. So there's a little bit of roundness, and we'll talk about why that's so important in a second. But just try it out. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. Focus on that floppy jaw, right? The second it goes into the ah, our jaw should be movable. And so this is kind of a weird thing to do, but you can check this, right? Don't wrench at it. But if your jaw is holding or locking in position, it's not going to want to budge. It should be soft. So it should be like blah, blah. So it's a really great exercise just to see if you can disconnect the jaw from the actual function of the voice. La, 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 la. It doesn't have to do so much, except really just get out of the way. Be careful that you're not dropping straight down. So if your muscles are popping out here and you're going like that, that's not quite healthy jaw motion. Think of it as a swivel. So it goes like, so it's a little softer, right? Versus like engaging and locking, you're going to get those bad pops and TMJ kinds of things from overdoing that. So focus on that soft, floppy jaw. So this is a little bit on that concept of release. It's really, really helpful. The other side is to really get comfortable with your resonance. So try this sort of particular pattern. We're going to go from oo to ah to e and back. And we're just trying to get that nice ring in our sound. We need the back pressure in order for vibrato to start happening. So if you're not accustomed to resonance and you're not used to listening for it and feeling for it, that's going to be a major block to your vibrato as well. So try this, going like, we'll go like, ooh, ah, ee, ah, ooh, ah, ee, ah, ooh. So I'm going from kind of rounding to neutral to getting my tongue to lift. And I'm trying to keep the overall shape of this to be pretty hollow and open, even though I'm rounding over with my lips or lifting up with my tongue. So think of the ah as that sort of default position, right? That feeling of the neutral larynx, right? The blah, blah, blah. And then go like, ooh, ah, ee, ah, ooh, ah, ee, ah, ooh. So with ooh, the lips are more round. Everything else is kind of neutral. The lips are open. Everything else is kind of neutral. And then for E, just the tongue lifts up and everything else is pretty neutral. So it's this sort of nice handoff. And you want to hear a nice ring at each sort of spot. But think of it as one sort of slide, right? Even though I'm kind of lingering with each vowel shape for a moment, it's really just a sort of like this one kind of weird glide shape going like, it almost sounds kind of like I'm like, why you kind of, but not quite, which is funny. But oh, so try to find a little more resonance work. Use your glides. Anything with finding a smooth tone in our content is going to be helpful with this. And you want to just see if the rest of your larynx and everything else, the muscles around the larynx, just start to kind of relax and feel like they're sort of draped. and suspended. That's a sign that we're getting good back pressure. You can use any of the SOVT style exercises that I did last week. Those are also very helpful for this in terms of finding that back pressure. For example, like you can do vibrato with your mouth closed. It might be kind of hard if you're not used to doing vibrato, but I could be like, so it's just a sign, if you're over holding consonant shapes and things like that, that's going to create too much of a static musculature. Yeah, isn't that fun? So you kind of have to search around for the resonance. And I love that you're trying it out with me. So I'm always spending a little bit of time with my voice. My typical routine, right? Relaxing my muscles, finding range of motion, working on my breath control, and working on resonance and alignment. And the best way to find this resonance stuff is just to practice moving from vowel to vowel, seeing if you can get your jaw a little more relaxed, if you can get your tongue a little more relaxed as well, as it sort of gently kind of floats from position to position. So this whole area up here is just getting into shapes and kind of just hanging out and floating. So we want to feel almost like we're like a puppet or like a ventriloquist, right? It's just like, so see if you can move your head around. Go back and forth between that and that nice sort of blah thing, just so you can feel all the muscles relax. So in general, when we're trying to find vibrato, we want to go towards slightly more round or covered vowels. That's going to help you find it if you're having trouble with it. It's not that it absolutely has to happen this way, but we're more likely to get that nice back pressure. So thinking of like all of our SOVT exercises, right? Those are going to help us. And particularly thinking about oo and then o, more covered vowels are going to be really, really helpful. You might do like the NG sound. That's like a particular SOVT thing to feel the back of your vocal tract and try to get everything lined up a little bit more, right? If our head and our neck is out like this, we're blocking things. Hi, greetings. Welcome. So you're going to want to try and sort of and feel for it by rounding over our vowels. So that's going to be helpful. And then try this NG sound, for example, going like, so finding that NG where the back of the tongue is up. It just helps us feel the back area, right? We tend to be sort of very forward focused on our face. You want to think more about the back of your head and trying to keep everything pretty neutral. So the NG helps us find that alignment. So sometimes I'll just slide around on that, right? And be like, and then just try to open everything without anything sort of coming out like this, right? I always talk about this sort of concept of singing being like this projectile thing, right? When we release our jaw, there's this temptation to want to do this kickback thing. Try to keep it stable. Be like, you can practice sliding around and just opening it up at random spots and see if you notice that happening. So that can be helpful just to help us start to get in the right position, neutral larynx, slightly rounded vowels, thinking about resonance in the back of our vocal tract. It's usually a little further back than people would think in terms of their perception, especially if you're having trouble having it happen. You're probably leaning into the mask a little bit too much and not finding sort of that balance of resonance on the other side. So let's keep moving with this. So the other thing that's really helpful for finding vibrato, it tends to happen at the ends of our phrases at first for people who are not accustomed to it. And then it's kind of harder to engage into your voice and open up into vibrato. So you're going to want to notice it on the sort of release of your phrases. Again, it's sort of that weird autonomic thing where we're less focused on it at that point. And so it drops a little more into that kind of active passive in between place. So we kind of have to trick ourselves into this. So I'll do a lot of exercises that involve changing direction and agility, and that helps us find it. And it helps us sort of stop lacking so much. So oscillate around a single note. This one is sort of like an ornamentation, and we're trying to find the vibrato at the last note as we sort of sustain for a second. So I go like this, and I'm using vowel shapes and glides to get that resonance happening. So it'll be like way so the idea is that sort of spinning around, and I'm not doing this like a trill. I'm not going like trying to do that. That's a bad technique. When people do that, it tends to make us want to shake and sort of manually do it. So you have to catch yourself. You have to go like way and you notice I'm doing these particular yaw moments at the end to try and see if I can keep that hollow internal space a little bit. And I'm doing it more dynamically rather than just trying to hold everything open. I'm thinking about just a moment of stretching and then relaxing. So going like way I'll move this around. Way you might find yourself getting stuck here, going like way and like trying to really hit each note. Don't worry about your pitch accuracy so much. Just add a little pulse of support and then come back and then relax it and then come right back. So it's going like way way so it's going to make our support kind of go like right. And so that's that fluctuation thing that's helping us get used to sort of being in this weird unstable place. So I always tell people when they're finding this, go towards the instability actually. If you're trying to control it too much, you're going to have trouble. So way and as you do it, try to go faster and faster. So way 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 and eventually you can think of this as like a turnaround, just going like way way and that can be helpful too. So that's just so going so fast that it's like on its own one single beat, right? Like way so as opposed to way so concept of neutral larynx, breathe in the shape, way way I'm thinking of that rounder ah vowel, so we don't want to be like way if I'm spreading out too much like this, it's going to tend to block or sort of flatten the vibrato. So be careful about spreading. So I'm working on this A vowel like this. It's very neutral and straight down. So when I do exercises where I'm just trying to find that type of A vowel, like you might be someone who just used to pronouncing with a little more brightness and mass, and that's going to hold you back from this exercise. So you're going to want to do stuff like this, like wa, we, we, and you want this all to look kind of the same. The only thing that's changing is the tongue in the back. Ya, ya, wa, we. That way you can get this very neutral feeling. Way, way, way. So you can practice going slow and fast, see if that helps you. So that one can be pretty fun. It's in a sort of smaller range. So another thing that you might find is doing wider ranges. This can be harder or easier for depends on the student. But I do this one just using a fifth, going like ha ya 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 ya. Right, continually just thinking of that sort of bouncy feeling. You can also use an O vowel. So it's kind of like a yo-yo, right? You're just coming up and down, up and down. So when yo 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 ya 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 ya, and so it's that rapid sort of motion that sort of tricks our body because we're creating space for that whole fifth. If the faster we go, we can't lock into it. We can't be like ya 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 ya. That kind of engagement or any of these muscles is gonna stop vibrato from happening. So just try to go faster than you're a little comfortable with, right? Like ya 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 ya, and you'll probably find it at the end of your the end of the exercise on the very last note. So ya 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 ya. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like a ghost. I like that. That's also another good term for like puppet, ghost, ventriloquist kind of a thing. So when you're doing it, you want to sort of maybe pay attention to like what is particularly feeling force, right? Is it like your jaw, your tongue? Is your head shaking a little bit, right? Give it a slightly different job. try to move it around from side to side as you go. But there's various reasons why it might be forced. Like you might not have quite the right amount of space. And so therefore you have to kind of force the space open as you're singing, and uh, that can cause some of that tension. Have a great day. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. You can always come back and check out the rest of this if you run out of time or you're just showing up now. Um, so probably it's a combination, right, of resonance and support. So by doing any sort of tension release things, identifying what your initial tension point is, that's going to help you. And then trying this sort of change of direction thing, right? Don't just try to like immediately make vibrato happen, but just focus on finding that sort of soft, relaxed balance anywhere. And then that sort of oscillation thing. And you might start to feel for it. Again, like vibrato is weird, like a lot of things in the voice. It's making more efficiency. So it's like, it feels almost like less is happening, right? And so if we're holding on to like a feeling of shaking, that's not quite the right way that we want to do it. Um, and so it's just a matter of like with anything like this, like I would need to see the student and I could get a sense of like what is particularly holding you back. And use a tool belt, sort of explore and see what kinds of exercises help it feel a little bit more loose. But let's keep going through some things, and maybe this will help you as well. So yeah, changing direction, really, really helpful. The other one that's helpful is getting our support, just when we're changing direction, where our support is coming off and on, and that sort of motion is really helpful. Anything that helps us just get a little more support activity is also been shown to help people find vibrato. So doing like staccatos or short detached notes. So this also, like for Jackie here, like this could help you, is just trying to see if you can be in the shape of a vowel and then drop down into your support and pulse it gently. So when people do staccatos kind of wrong, they're kind of like putting more energy into coming off of it. And I like to think of it as you're breathing low, sort of this apagio breath, right? Our belly is expanding, and then it's expanded already. And then we pulse out from there. So we first have to get it active and open. And this is my lower breath, right? My lower abdominal muscles. And then you kind of pulse on top of it. So you think of the activity as actually the engagement uh, extra from the expansion. So it'll feel like it kind of leans out a little bit more. It almost looks like you're continuing that inhalation process. Another analogy I use is like it's like a Pilates class or something where you're like in a boat pose and then you're pulsing from there. So it's already active and then you're engaging. So simple exercises like staccatos can be really helpful. So you can take a spot and just be like this, like ah, 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 ah. So I'm already in that position, and play around with different vowel shapes. So I'd be like, he, 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 ha, 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 he, 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 he. So we've just found, like through working with lots of students, this is a common thing, but starting and stopping your voice like that can also help us find this. You want to start and stop it and then try to go into a sustain for a moment. So it seems really simple, but you think of that neutral larynx, dropping everything, breathing low, and then maybe putting your hand by your belly, right below your belly button, and going, ha, 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 he, 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 ho, 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 hoo, 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 hoo. And that can also be really helpful. And then you can make it more dynamic. You could do an exercise like this, going like, ya, ha, ha. So I'm going with that short detach. Ya, ha, 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 ha. And then on the descent, trying to see if I can smooth it out and make it a little more legato. Um, it's just this weird thing about creating that sort of fast twitch with these muscles, getting the diaphragm to start to do some stuff. Again, we control this with our lower abdominal muscles, but it will make our diaphragm engage and relax, and that'll help it get more flexible so that it can start to oscillate naturally. So that's why the staccato stuff is really, really helpful. So it can be simple. It can be like, hey, 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 oh, and play around around with your vowels, right? Make these exercises your own. Like I'm going from A to O to ah. You could just mix and match it, right? So hey, 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 oh, hey, 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 oh. And then the other trick to doing this is don't get so regimented with your practice where like, okay, I'm going to do like 3 minutes of this one and 3 minutes of this. Like mix and match them and start to juggle the techniques, because it's a balancing act. It's like we're juggling a bunch of balls in the air. So you're going to want to kind of get a little bit of each feeling until everything starts to kind of balance out. So when I'm really helping someone find vibrato, I'm usually like switching back and forth so they don't have any chance to get too like locked into whatever the feeling is of a particular exercise. Um, so that would be like the main thing. And then like just, it's important to acknowledge that imitation is really a powerful tool. So watch people as they're singing with vibrato, and try to use your mirror neurons, right? Imitate, like, for example, even here, but like imagining, for example, like just when I say, like, imagine you're singing something classical and maybe even start a few lines of a classical piece. Um, that can help people. So it's just funny, right? It's just like we're working so hard on all these things, and I'm like, okay, now you're a classical singer. Breathe in, look like that person who's about to go like, "Caro mio ben," and all of a sudden, like vibrato starts happening just because they're thinking about it a little differently, and they're thinking of a character that's not their own voice. Because we get stuck with the idea of like, my voice sounds a certain way, and so our muscle memory gets stuck that way. And so I'm like, character voice, be a character, right? Find your classical version of yourself, and eventually over time it becomes like just your open vibrato voice, right? But at first it might feel like something extra or separate, and so I'll just find little things like, here's like one, I might go like, Vincero, like, just thinking of these big moments. Vincero. It's this concept of like going up to a high note and then coming down into that nice O vowel. Just a really good example of it. Like Vincero, because I'm engaging and then I relax a little bit, and that helps me sort of drop into that feeling vibrato. I know I'm doing it the whole time, but again, this concept of going past sort of a spot and then rounding back, can really, really help people. We almost have to confuse ourselves. So let me quickly just review this flow, and then we'll move on to some other concepts. But the first thing that I would do, is maybe just take a moment, connecting with my basic sort of voice, feel it dropping the larynx, a little bit of stretching to keep things loose. You can even do some laryngeal massage, right? Feeling flexibility there so that my tongue can relax. Again, if you have a lot of tongue tension, that can really block our vibrato. So you want to be careful with that, especially as you're trying to drop and open up. Don't let your tongue pull back. That can really, really mess with it. And then, so first thing I'm doing is just kind of light and fast, going blah, 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 trying to get my jaw to drop and be floppy. Blah, blah, blah. Let it wiggle a little bit. It'll be weird. It'll not sound great, right? Because I'm making it wobble, but trying to detach my jaw. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, 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 etc., etc. Then I might start doing this oscillating thing, the little sort of ornamentation, going way up, way up, way up, way up, going faster and faster until it becomes just like an ornament. Way up. Then I might go wider, right? So doing like ya 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 ya, yo 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 yo. Seeing if I can get it to start to oscillate at the ends of my phrases. Doing this staccato exercise, right? Going like ha 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 he 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 ho, right? Mix and match your vowels, and then going like ha 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 ha. Play around with your vowels. It can be It's really about this internal relaxed space. Move your head and your neck around as you're doing it. Look at yourself in a mirror. Put your hand by your belly. Maybe here just to feel oscillation or tension. Um, those are all really, really great ways to start doing this. Then maybe try a few lines of some classical piece. So I was doing like Caro mio ben from the Italian art songs. So this is a kind of a starting place for a lot of people doing classical music. And then I was just kind of showing this dramatic moment, not where it normally sits really high up in the range, but going like Vinciano. Just really try to feel like you're in the moment, being like an opera singer, because classical music has more liberal use of vibrato. It's partially because it helps amplify our sound and also make for more endurance. Obviously, vibrato is found in a lot of different styles, but it tends to be more on the classical side, and then less as we go towards like contemporary and country music and things like that. So as we go more twangy and more forward in the mask, we tend to get less vibrato happening. So if you're someone who uses a lot of mask singing, focus on, yeah, yes, I was doing Nessun Dorma, exactly. Yeah, good, I love that. Just a little kind of piece of it. And again, you don't even have to do the exact sort of interval. You can just kind of use those word shapes to practice. With like any sort of Italian dialect, that's going to be really helpful because we have more pure vowels. So it might actually help you doing something outside of maybe your typical language. Uh, you know, if you're an Italian speaker, try German or something else, right? Just to get you sort of out of that sort of habituated muscle memory. That's the other part of it. So imitation, find a character, and then think about these rounder sounds, right? So anything going up into an O vowel. So like when I'm going like right, our temptation is to want to go and kind of lose the integrity of our lips and that cover. Trust that it's going to keep going back into your vocal tract if you do the roundness and you keep everything else relaxed. So when we're rounding with the front of our mouth, it's tempting to want to curl with your tongue or hold with your jaw. Just think of it as just really the upper lip, right? And we're just going like and if you're thinking about I need a little more space, think of it as like an extension of a whoa, so that if it's on the glide, you're going to allow your vowel to open up more naturally, rather than thinking about it as like trying to do something artificially. It follows the glide. So I'm going like essentially from here to here, going so you can see why I did that exercise where I'm going like just on a single vowel, going like so finding these smooth connections where we're not locking, but thinking of a longer legato line also helps us find this vibrato, because anytime we get locked, we don't have the right release to create our vibrato sound. So if you're doing something where you're going right, I did that all straight tone that time. There's this difficulty with music, right, where we have these kind of points, right, our individual notes, um, but that often makes us kind of lock around each shape. And so you want to think about the through line, sort of the overarching architecture of it as this like slide, right, that's happening, going right? And then try to see if you can catch these little moments on the way, but don't lose that line, right? Going like, um, so yeah, this is the idea there. And if you're again finding like you're locking and your tongue is pulling back, you can try some of these exercises where you put like an almond on your tongue. Be careful with this. Put it not too far back, and just do vowels, right? So this would be a good one. Going like Hey, oh, eh, oh, eh. There's a tiny bit of motion with the tongue, but that'll help you become a little more aware and sort of minimize any trying to pull back or any sort of thing like that. You can also feel under here if it's rooting down with your tongue or pushing against your teeth. That's also going to sometimes block our vibrato. So that's the main concept here. So let's talk a little bit about when people are talking about like vibrato issues. So the issues are when we do a wobble as like a habit, and not like a stylistic thing. And if you're finding like your flutter is like too tight and it starts to sound like, I don't know, like not what you want, maybe like a little too um, young or whatever the sound is. It's not opening up and increasing the volume. So with the wobble thing, which is often something that happens to older singers a lot of the time. So it's like a kind of a typical thing, not always, but it certainly can. Usually means that there's not good balance of breath support underneath, and that's causing the mechanism to oscillate too much. It's like you've already learned vibrato, so it's in your muscle memory, and so this happens later on. And you'll start to see like excessive shaking, and the whole mechanism will lose its stability because it's over shaking. This means that you're going to want to do more SOVT style exercises, use your straw, do stuff where you're going like, Mm. Ha, 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 ha. Right, switching between staccato and more active legato with vibrato sound into it, but start with the staccato sound. Doing more of that's going to help that type of singer. And you might be overly opening your vowel shapes to try and make the vibrato sound more even, and actually finding a slightly more narrow shape is going to be helpful. Right, so you can see this can be tricky depending on what's happening with the voice. If you're finding you're in too much of a flutter, it's usually because of some of these tension issues with the jaw. So trying to find that more like neutral larynx feeling, and trying to get the jaw to be more floppy and the tongue as well. So doing any of these kinds of glide things with like the ya 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 wa is going to be helpful. Using the NG sound is also going to be really helpful for that kind of singer. Now, the other thing that I think is kind of interesting is whenever we're told like, oh, there's something wrong with your voice, avoid that. It leads to other problems because you're now trying to like stop something from happening. And so we sometimes overdo it, or it creates a different kind of tension in the sort of need to get rid of something and feeling like it's bad. So the other thing is learn to control it actually. So like if you have a wobble, if you can start, it's just like with cracking when I talk about like vocal cracking, um, you can start to feel out what it's like to be too wide and then relaxing your vocal support, going towards a breathier kind of tone, and kind of working back and forth. And this gets you to a little bit more of like our R&B kind of style or a jazz style where we start to play with vibrato. Rock music does this too, right? It's not that rock is always straight tone. In fact, sometimes it's the extreme contrast of styles that makes rock or R&B have its particular sound. So it's not that it's like we don't do vibrato in that style, but it's just how you utilize it and how often. So you can think of like doing these where I like I'll just do a simple kind of a few note sort of thing and go like open, and then think of like adding the a little bit of breathiness. So I spike into it and then start to open the vowel. Open, wide, right? And so you can kind of spring load it. Wide. But strangely enough, it's actually like less energy with the lower body. It's a hard thing for me to show, right? Because these energetics are so subtle. But I'm thinking like my belly is just like a little um, less active. It's like kind of just sort of hanging there a little bit, and you might even feel that your breath support starts to kind of relax in on itself. That's we're utilizing the concept of the wobble for a stylistic thing. So hey, hey. So hey, then you can practice. So opening up, relaxing your support, and starting to get your vibrato to happen. You could also think about extending the range of the pitch a little bit. So if I'm like, hey, that's not really noticed as like a pitch change, but if I go, hey, and I think of like actually trying to go like to a half step or even a whole step, or sometimes when it's really wide and it's higher in our range, it can even be like a minor third, which is really crazy. It's weird how that it'll actually sound okay in certain situations, but that's pretty wide. So if I'm like, right, you can see that's going to start to cause this weird thing that's ultimately not healthy, right? When we see this or the jaws oscillating, that's a backup of tension that doesn't need to be there. This muscle is moving with the change of pressure, but really it means that there's too much pressure happening. So if you're, if you see it, that kind of classic musical theater thing where they're like, no, it starts to happen like that. Like I can only do that manually by moving my jaw because it's not a good habit, right? No, all of this is actually happening internally and it's much more subtle energetics than we should visually see. But if I practice going like, and I go outside of our pitch range, you'll start to feel the wobble. So sometimes, like, strangely enough, like, understand what you're doing, feel it out for a sec, just like with cracking. And that can actually help you break that cycle sometimes because then you can learn the spectrum. Um, do the staccato style exercises if you're trying to get rid of your wobble. Try to find a little more space and release if you've got the flutter. Now, for the flutter, you can do the same sort of thing in reverse. You can think of collapsing your vowel shape or your glide and then engaging your support a little bit. So going like, hey, why? And you can even think of doing a vibrato like on your consonant, right? Like, hey, when, right? So that starts to sound a little more jazzy, right? If I'm like, when I, hey, so I'm using the diphthongs to start to make it kind of speed up its fluttering. So you can really think of this as like energetics, right? And like aerodynamics. It's like if I have a big space, the vibrations take a little bit of time to come back and forth, especially if there isn't a lot of spin, right? A lot of vocal support. It starts to kind of go like that, right? And it's out of orbit. And if there's a lot of spin and not a lot of space, it starts to hit all the walls and go like, hey, why? So you can practice going back and forth and be like, open, right? Bun, and just kind of see if you can start to get that to oscillate. It does take some practice, and ultimately, like I find it happens the best when we're imitating a style and when we're sort of in the moment stylistically, right? So that with any sort of stylistic thing, we have to identify what it is, but then we kind of have to integrate it just into our practice. So using imitation is really, really important, but you kind of need both sides, right? So imitation without understanding why sometimes leads to weird things. Understanding why, but not actually trying to imitate or listen to examples of it, also, you might get stuck, right? And I don't think anyone's really learned how to sing just by reading a book, right? It's there's a lot of this legacy of like trying and understanding from someone who's found that experience. So yeah, so again, the danger here is trying to force your vibrato, and that happens when we have a backup of pressure in the wrong way, where muscles are starting to kind of lock. And so what we have to kind of identify is the tension release required, and then keep trying to explore healthy vocal technique, right? So any exercise done well is going to help you start to find and develop your vibrato. It does take a little bit of time. It's like a conditioning, sort of strengthening kind of a thing. So don't try to do it in like one sitting if you've never done vibrato before. It'll happen through your practice. So I'm often just reminding people, be patient. We'll do like a little bit of that kind of practice, more agility stuff. And then I'll point it out and be like, oh, look right there, you did vibrato. Save the feeling and try it again. But it's like that weird try not try kind of a thing because again, it's an autonomic sort of thing that our body drops into. So there's a feeling of kind of relaxing into vibrato, which is tricky. That's why we do all of this kind of oscillating stuff. So that's the idea. Again, like any exercise, as you go up into your higher register, starting to round over is going to be really helpful. So when it's integrated into my whole practice, right? Doing the like, no, 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 think about, okay, I'm adding vibrato. No, 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 no. The reason it's going, doing that back and forth is to help with these kinds of concepts, so we don't get just locked on a note for too long. Again, when we're trying to find stuff, it's just very tempting. I have to stop students all the time where they just try to hit the same note over and over again, or they just kind of hold it for longer, and that's not going to necessarily help you. In fact, it'll kind of set you back. So short, detached. This is why I do these ones where I'm like, and I try to go faster and faster, like you'll find vibrato kind of slows things down a little bit too. So what you'll notice is if you're always using vibrato, it can make your voice a little more sluggish because takes a little bit of time just to kind of fall into the undulation cycle. So it's not like we have to do it all the time, 100%. And this leads me to that question that one of you asked, which was, how do I straighten out my tone? Think of the onset and extending the onset and having a slightly firmer vocal support. So adding in maybe like doing one of these sustained exercises, going like, no, 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 no. You'll notice the vibrato is going to happen at the end. So see if you can extend that first part of your voice. It'll feel like you're holding a little bit more, and then flattening the vowel out a little bit. So nya, 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 nya. So anytime you dig more into the mask, you're more likely to kind of flatten out the sound. It's still there, but we're essentially subduing it to such a small flutter or shimmer, as we call it sometimes, that we can't really perceive it in the same way. So you're going to want to think of extending the onset of your voice. Nya, nya, nya. Like I'm going like a little more firmly. So you could think of just taking everything we just did and reverse engineering it, right? So you're thinking of driving forward with everything a little bit more, and then kind of purposefully using the tongue coming forward to kind of narrow the space out a little bit more forward rather than back. And that can typically help people with finding just a little more straight tone. Doing more exercises. It's funny, right? Some of this becomes like a thought, but doing more exercises where you're keeping the agility but not allowing it to sustain at the very end, right? Don't let yourself drop into it. So I might be like, way, and then just stop it. Don't let it continue. Think of it as like a strict cutoff. So way, because one thing that happens, like for example in choral music, when you're doing tight harmonies, if you put a lot of vibrato into it, it kind of messes up those tight harmonies because there's so much oscillation, it starts to get kind of blurry. So there's lots of situations where you want to just kind of stick a note, and that's actually going to be a better technique for that kind of choral music. That it's actually, in some ways it's kind of hard, right? Because it means that we can't let our voice sort of relax into the vibrato. So I find like in choral things where there's all straight tone, finding a couple moments where it can open up to vibrato is really healthy. Or like, if you're planning concerts, having a little bit of a mix can be helpful, because that over time, just lots of straight tone singing can kind of be a little fatiguing. So I always tell people, like, even if you're primarily a straight tone singer, like warm up and practice with vibrato. It actually helps you open up your voice and sustain higher notes that you wouldn't normally because of that dispersing of pressure. So there's certain things that you can't really, it's kind of harder to feel until you actually find your vibrato. But I highly recommend that. That's actually a great way to open everything up. And ultimately it'll get you more sort of long lasting, smooth, higher notes as you're singing them. Now, if you're someone, just really quickly too, I did this all in kind of chest voice. If you're someone who sings more in head voice, the trick with the head voice thing is finding good chord compression, like always. So making sure that there's not a lot of air escaping because that's going to make it a lot harder to create that oscillation. So like there's that concept of like putting a candle in front of your singing, and if it's blowing out the candle, you're pushing way too much air out, and it's actually more resistance of air. So you might practice similar things up in your head voice, going like put the G's in there and that kind of sound, and that might help you start to feel better chord compression as well. And if you're someone who's trying to open up your head voice, finding vibrato up there is going to be a really great way to do that. It's just kind of like the trick. So hopefully this has been helpful. And I know it's a kind of like a elementary topic, but I think of vibrato as kind of like beginning to intermediate. It's that kind of the crossover. Like if you can't find vibrato in your voice, it kind of holds you back, right? With your ability to change your tone and amplify your volume and open up your range. So, and it's a sign that something is a little bit out of balance, right? There's some tension, and that might take some time to undo the tension first before you find your vibrato. There's maybe not, you're not quite connecting to your resonance, or you're not quite connecting to your support, and finding the balance between the two things. So it really does take some practice and some guidance sometimes. So again, if you're really struggling with it, we have more content on this. Keep up a routine and try not to overdo it in any one setting or sitting. Um, and over time, you will start to develop your vibrato. So you're very welcome. I really appreciate seeing so many familiar people coming and following all of this. And again, like as someone who's sung a lot and for my whole life pretty much, like coming back to these concepts is always valuable. When I'm like, I'm just gonna really feel out my vibrato and start to hear, like, does it sound like a flutter, wobble? Am I starting to feel instability? Am I having trouble accessing my vibrato? These are all really, really helpful things to do, even as an advanced singer. So I'm always just like, go to the fundamentals. It's the key to finding advanced singing is by really, really, truly understanding the fundamentals and knowing that once you felt them, one time, it's going to change a little bit throughout your life. That's why, like, as you age, your voice changes. And the more you can keep your practice current, the more likely you're going to notice when things are developing a certain way and steer them away from that before it becomes like a really big habit that's a little bit harder to kick. So, thank you and have a great rest of your evening or day or whatever time you're at. And I really appreciate it. And as always, thanks for listening. And I will catch you all next week, and we'll keep up with some fundamentals for the next few weeks. And then we'll dive into some more stylistic practice. And as always, let me know if there's some other things that you want to cover in particular, and I'll try to throw them in the next batch. So looking forward to it, and I will catch you all next week. All right, take care.